4 members of the Proud Boys on trial for their alleged roles in the January 6th insurrection. They've now been convicted of seditious conspiracy.
Jurors are still continuing to deliberate whether a 5th member is guilty of seditious conspiracy. The jury convicted all 5 defendants for obstruction in an official proceeding. This partial verdict follows more than 1 week of deliberations in a roughly 4-month-long trial. For more, let's bring in CBS News congressional correspondent Scott MacFarlane and CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson, who's also a professor at Loyola Law School. Scott, we're going to start with you because you've been closely following this story. You're outside of the courthouse right now. Tell us, what's your reaction to this partial verdict?
This is a giant victory for the U.S. Justice Department with a capital G. They've already secured about a dozen guilty pleas or convictions for others to the charge of seditious conspiracy, of plotting to block the peaceful transfer of power in America. But this case is different and has been from the start because one of the 5 Proud Boys defendants, Enrique Tarrio, who was just convicted of seditious conspiracy, wasn't at the Capitol January 6th. He was up near New York. For the Department of Justice to have successfully secured a guilty verdict to this conspiracy charge for somebody who was not at the Capitol itself January 6th could give the Department of Justice enormous leverage if there are future cases of key figures who weren't actually there who will eventually be charged with seditious conspiracy.
Certainly sends a loud message. Jessica, help us understand this partial verdict and what leads to that type of outcome and what the point would be of announcing a partial verdict before it's fully reached.
So the partial verdict indicates that they were not able to find, at least for some of the charges, they were not able to conclude that all 5 were either guilty or not guilty. As Scott said, for that big top line charge, the seditious conspiracy, what the jury found is that 4 of the 5 defendants are guilty. The same for the second charge, dealing with conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding. There are lesser charges that don't deal with conspiracy, where the jury was able to find that all 5 defendants were in fact guilty. So there's a few things for the jury to consider, but the main ones are whether or not Pizzola, that was the last defendant, that 5th defendant, whether or not he will also be found guilty of those 2 big conspiracy charges, the seditious conspiracy, the obstruction of an official proceeding. And how does this happen? This happens in courtrooms throughout the country every day, where the jury is able to go defendant by defendant, count by count, and they're able to reach a consensus with respect to some defendants and some counts. And the judge will essentially say, you know what, come back, give us the verdict where you were able to agree, take that off your plate, and now just focus in on, in this case, it's really Pizzola. And while there's one other thing for them to consider, what we're really looking at are those 2 conspiracy charges. It's interesting because Pizzola was very active, not like Tarrio, who wasn't there, but he was very active on January 6th at the Capitol, walking in, smashing windows. So it's interesting to me that he's the one where there was some disagreement among the jurors.
That's interesting. Scott, I want to bring you into this conversation. Talk about the arguments that were presented in this case. And the defense lawyers, were they unsuccessful largely in making their arguments? What's going on, to Jessica's point?
5 different defendants, 5 different defense attorneys, 5 different strategies. Dominic Pizzola is one in this group, one of 2 who actually took the stand in his own defense. I was there for that testimony. It was distinctively and noticeably contentious, the cross-examination. Pizzola was defiant, to say the least. The jury hasn't reached a not guilty verdict. They just need more time to figure out what to do with Dominic Pizzola on those 2 top-level charges of seditious conspiracy and conspiracy to obstruct. This group of 5 has been distinctive from the start. They were all a focal point of that House January 6th Select Committee because 4 of the 5 were so visible in all those videos and images from January 6th. Dominic Pizzola of Rochester, New York, had that police riot shield and smashed open a window, leading the mob forward. The others, Ethan Nordine, Joseph Biggs, Zachary Reel, accused of being at the forefront of the mob, of being leaders. But what's more, the argument prosecutors made unambiguously is that this group planned They plotted. They came here and were not just caught up in the moment, but came here anticipating a moment and anticipated being part of it. They argued Tarrio did the same. Now, the Department of Justice had a response from the defense attorneys who said, no, this group didn't plot, didn't plan, were truly part of an organic movement they didn't expect. The jury, in at least 4 of these 5 cases, didn't buy it.
And that's huge, Scott. So to that point, Jessica, what type of precedent is this jury, is this judge setting for other January 6 cases where a similar argument could be made? We were just caught up in the moment. The president said go there. Social media said appear at the Capitol. How far will that fly?
Well, I think it is important that you zeroed in on that here. And there's really 2 things we're focused on. One, that the jury was able to find a guilty verdict for conspiracy when it comes to sedition for somebody who wasn't present. The other, that the defense here, which really rested on this idea of, we didn't know what was going to happen that day. We just showed up and the former president told us what to do. I think partly based on a jury instruction, that the jury found that at least right before they took action, there was an understanding, an agreement to take unlawful action, and that was enough here for the conspiracy charges. That's also something we want to look at moving forward.
Incredible stuff for our viewers to understand. Scott MacFarlane and Jessica Levinson, thanks for walking us through these developments. We appreciate it.
Thank you.